It's Christopher Snowdon. Welcome. He's a journalist and historian. 10 years ago, he graduated in history at Lancaster University and is currently writing his first book, Velvet Glove, Iron Fist, A History of Anti-Smoking. Some chapters of that book and a lot of other interesting material can be freely accessed online on the website velvetgloveironfist.com. Yeah, Christopher, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay? No, it's on. It's on. It's on just a little bit. It's on. One, two. It's better. Okay. I'm here today to talk about the modern anti-smoking movement. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about the sordid subject of money and how what was a fairly innocuous campaign to bring about non-smoking sections evolved into an extraordinarily wealthy enterprise which is dedicated now to the extinction of tobacco. There are virtually no real volunteers in today's tobacco control movement. When you came in this morning, you would have noticed there was nobody protesting there. Maybe if it had been 20 or 30 years ago, you would have at least found 2 or 3 people with a placard. It's not really a voluntary movement, and yet it continues to have the appearances of a grassroots campaign. It has the appearance of being run by volunteers, it has the appearance of being funded by the generosity of the public. And this, of course, works in its favour because people are naturally more inclined to support a voluntary group or a charity than they are to support a politician or an industry. In reality, its funding comes from 3 main sources. It comes from pharmaceutical companies, it comes from the state, and it comes from charities. These sources of funding are so intertwined that often it's hard to see where one ends and the other begins. So you have a case where the pharmaceutical companies are funding the charities, the governments have often set up the charities themselves, and then the charities are lobbying the governments. That need not necessarily be an issue, and I'm not begrudging anybody making a living. I'm not necessarily against charities paying for people who work for them. And if you don't like it, then you simply don't have to give to the charity. But the problem comes when you don't have any choice as to whether to give to the charity, because the charity is being funded by your own taxes. And the problem comes when you arrive in the bizarre situation of having government-funded charities using taxpayers' money to lobby the government to do something that the government has already decided it wants to do. And the problem comes when the makers of pharmaceutical products are giving millions of dollars to groups whose primary aim is to put the makers of traditional nicotine products out of business. And I know it's probably rather late in the afternoon for a history lesson, so I'll keep this bit short. But I need to tell you that once upon a time there was a genuine grassroots anti-smoking movement. In fact, anti-smoking movements have popped up throughout history from time to time, usually run by small bands of volunteers and usually operating on shoestring budgets, usually also being stupendously unsuccessful. And there was a plethora of these kind of groups in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They were the placard-waving, letter-writing, church hall meeting kind of groups, and they disappeared entirely all around the world after the Second World War, and only began to appear again from the early 1970s. The most prominent of these groups was called GASP, standing for the Group Against Smoking Pollution, and they were really quite typical of the placard wavers that had come before them. GASP was founded by a housewife and an environmentalist called Clara Gowan in the state of Maryland in 1971. She set up the society with a few friends from a local church, charged a $1 a year membership. They made badges, they petitioned politicians, printed posters, published pamphlets, wrote letters, all the kind of things these small campaigning groups did back then. New branches of GASP sprang up across the states, formed by like-minded individuals in the 1970s, first on the West Coast, then on the East Coast, and then throughout America and into Canada. It had a big voice, but it was a very small organisation. Even by the late 1980s, a senior member of GASP was advising anyone who was planning to form their own anti-smoking group, saying, don't expect crowds at your meetings, expect maybe 5 to 10 people at most. But then two things happened in the late 20th century that transformed the makeup and fortunes of the emerging anti-smoking movement. Firstly, they began to receive very large amounts of money from the state. Secondly, they began to receive money from pharmaceutical companies. And the result of all this was that a small-scale non-smokers' rights movement, which is what they were, developed into a large-scale tobacco control movement. And there is a world difference between a non-smokers' rights movement and a tobacco control movement, because the latter looks completely true and the extinction of tobacco. Now this change began, as these changes often did, in California. In 1988, a campaign led by Americans for non-smokers' rights and GASP resulted in the passage of Proposition 99. Proposition 99 bumped up the tax on a pack of cigarettes, but its real achievement was to secure a commitment from the state's politicians that 20% of all the money raised from this would be funneled directly towards anti-smoking projects. So Proposition 99 created in California an almost bottomless pit of money of some 500. And of course it was the longest serving activists who were best placed to take up fairly lucrative jobs in tobacco control and doing research into things like second-hand smoke. The same thing happened again on a much, much bigger scale 10 years later, when the American tobacco industry settled with the US government, creating the Master Settlement Agreement, which was worth $246 billion. And that deal turned the financial affairs of the anti-smoking movement upside down. New anti-smoking organisations were created all over the country, making millions available in grants for researchers to study every aspect of tobacco control. And the anti-smoking movement from that point on had more money than it knew what to do with. But it didn't stop there. The rags to riches story was completed when the makers of pharmaceutical nicotine began to get involved. The nicotine patch had been developed in the early 80s, but it was first manufactured and appeared as a commercial entity as Nicotrol, which was manufactured by Pfizer and marketed by Johnson & Johnson. The founder of Johnson & Johnson was General Robert Johnson, and he died in 1968, and when he did, he left a legacy of $1.2 billion to be used for good causes, with the money spent by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Now, to this day, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation receives the lion's share of its income from Johnson & Johnson. It currently owns around about 40 million shares in Johnson & Johnson, which last time I checked was worth about $67 a year. So the total value of the stake is around about $3 billion.